Swamp is not a word that people use when they are giving you something valuable. Swamp is the word people use when they are giving you something they want to stop owning. The way a man hands you a bucket with a hole in the bottom and calls it a gift. The way a woman gives you a dress with a stain on the front and calls it a kindness. Swamp means water where water should not be. Ground that is not ground. Soil that is not soil, but a suspension of mud and root, and decomposing leaf that will swallow a boot to the ankle, and a fence post to the knee, and a woman's hope to whatever depth hope reaches before it drowns. Harlan Vance used the word with precision. 17 acres of swamp, he said. And the way he said it made clear that the 17 acres were not a gift, but a disposal. The removal of an unwanted daughter-in-law accomplished through the transfer of an unwanted property. The transaction designed so that Harlan could tell the church he had been generous while Coraline could tell no one, because Coraline was being sent to a swamp, and swamps do not have churches. The family gathered in the parlor of the Vance farmhouse on the morning of March 14, 1885. Harlan stood by the fireplace with a document in his hand, reading it aloud the way a judge reads a sentence. Parmelia sat in her high-backed chair with her hands folded in her lap, her face arranged in an expression of sorrowful duty, the expression of a woman who is doing something difficult because it must be done. Josiah stood by the window with his back to the room, looking out at the fields he would inherit, the fields his wife and daughters would never see again. And Coraline stood in the center of the room, with Winifred clutching her skirt on one side and Hattie balanced on her hip on the other, listening to her father-in-law explain that her marriage had failed. Not in those words exactly. Harlan Vance was a man who understood the power of euphemism. He spoke of biological disappointment. He spoke of the Vance legacy and the necessity of male heirs. He spoke of 5 years of patience and prayer and the unfortunate reality that some women are simply not capable of producing sons. He did not mention that Coraline had produced 2 daughters. He did not mention that she had been pregnant with sons twice and lost them both, once in the 5th month and once in the 7th. Losses that had nearly killed her, and that Parmelia had called divine judgment rather than medical tragedy. He did not mention any of this because daughters were not relevant to the Vance legacy, and miscarriages were evidence of weakness, and weakness was not something the Vance family acknowledged in its own bloodline. What Harlan mentioned was the deed. 17 acres along Willow Creek in the southern bottomlands of Perry County, Tennessee. Property that had belonged to the Vance family for 40 years. Property that no one had ever successfully farmed because it was not farmland. It was swamp. A gift, Harlan called it. A final act of generosity from a family that had given Coraline 5 years of shelter and opportunity, and that could not in good conscience send her away with nothing. Parmelia nodded at this. Parmelia, who had made Coraline eat in the kitchen while the family ate in the dining room. Parmelia, who had called Winifred a disappointment on the day she was born because Winifred had been born female. Parmelia, who had looked at Hattie in her cradle and said that at least this one was quiet, as though silence were the best thing a daughter could offer. Parmelia nodded and said that the Vance family had always been charitable. 17 acres of swamp for a woman who could not produce an heir, Parmelia added. It seems fitting. Like for like. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that would not stop burning. And Josiah. Josiah stood at the window with his back to his wife and his daughters, his shoulders hunched, his hands in his pockets. His reflection in the glass showing a face that was looking at nothing. He did not speak. He did not turn around. He did not do what a husband is supposed to do when his family's being cast out, which is to object. He simply stood there. Because Josiah Vance was 29 years old and had never once in his life contradicted his father. Because Josiah loved Coraline and loved his daughters, but loved them in the way that weak men love, which is to say that he loved them until loving them required courage, and then his love simply stopped. Coraline watched his reflection in the window glass and understood that she was alone. She had been alone for 5 years. She simply had not allowed herself to know it until now. Winifred tugged at her skirt. "Mama," the 4-year-old whispered, "why is grandfather making that face?" Coraline did not answer. She was looking at the deed in Harlan's hand, at the words written on it, at the signatures at the bottom. She was calculating. She was a woman who had learned to calculate quickly because calculation was the only weapon she had. 17 acres. Swamp. 4 miles from the nearest neighbor, 6 miles from town. No road, only a track. No cabin, only whatever she could build. No help, only whatever she could provide for herself. And 2 daughters, 4 years old and 2 years old. Children who needed to be fed and sheltered and protected from a world that had already decided they were worthless because they had been born the wrong sex. Harlan finished reading the deed and held it out. "This concludes the matter," he said. "You may collect your belongings from the servants' quarters. The wagon will take you as far as the creek crossing. After that, you will have to proceed on foot." Coraline felt Winifred's small hand tighten on her skirt. She felt Hattie shift on her hip, restless, too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to sense that something was wrong. She looked at Permelia. She looked at Harlan. She looked at the reflection of her husband in the window, the man who would not turn around. And then she reached out and took the deed from Harlan's hand. "I accept," Coraline said, "and I will not forget." She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She did not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She simply turned and walked out of the parlor with the deed in one hand, and her daughter on her hip and her other daughter clutching her skirt, and she did not look back. Winifred wanted to bring her doll, the porcelain doll with the painted face and the cotton dress that she had been given on her 3rd birthday, the only toy she had ever owned that was truly hers. But when she reached for it, Permelia's hand shot out and snatched it away. "This belongs to the Vance household," Permelia said. "Vance property stays with the Vance family." Winifred's face crumpled. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Coraline knelt beside her daughter, there in the hallway of the house where she had lived for 5 years, where she had worked like a servant and been treated like a curse, and she wiped the tears from Winifred's face with her own calloused hands. "We will make new things," Coraline said quietly. "Better things. Things that belong only to us." Winifred nodded, though she did not understand. She was 4 years old. She did not know yet that the things people take from you matter less than the things you build for yourself. She would learn. They all would. The wagon was waiting in the yard. The hired driver did not speak. He had been told not to speak, and he was a man who followed instructions. He loaded the belongings that Coraline had been allowed to take, a trunk of clothes, a crate of tools, a sack of seeds, bedding, a cook stove that had been dented so badly it had been destined for the scrap heap anyway, and he helped her climb onto the seat with her daughters beside her. Then he drove south. The road wound through hills covered with hardwood forest, past farms that grew smaller and poorer the farther south they traveled, past clearings where families had tried to make homes and abandoned them when the land refused to cooperate. The sky was gray. The air was cold. March in Tennessee was the cruelest month, neither winter nor spring, the season when hope struggled to survive. Winifred fell asleep against Coraline's shoulder. Hattie fussed and then quieted, her small body warm against her mother's chest. And Coraline watched the landscape change. The hills flattened. The hardwoods gave way to cypress and tupelo. The ground grew soft, then wet, then liquid. Water appeared between the trees, standing pools that reflected the gray sky like mirrors laid flat on the earth. The wagon stopped at a creek crossing where the road ended. "Your property is on the other side," the driver said. "About a mile south. Follow the high ground on the east bank. That is the only part that is not underwater." He helped Coraline unload her belongings. He stood for a moment, looking at the woman and the 2 small children and the pile of possessions that would not be enough to keep them alive through the summer. "Good luck," he said. And then he drove away. Coraline stood at the edge of the swamp and looked at what she had been given. 17 acres of water and mud and cypress trees, rising from the water like the columns of a ruined cathedral. Spanish moss hanging from the branches in gray curtains that moved in the breeze like the hair of ghosts. The smell of decay, rich and dark. The smell of things dying and being reborn in an endless cycle that had been going on since before people came to this place. Hattie began to cry. The mosquitoes had found them, clouds of them rising from the water. Winifred woke and looked around with wide, frightened eyes. "Mama," she said, "this is our home now?" Coraline looked at her daughter. She looked at the swamp. She looked at the deed in her pocket, the 17 acres that everyone said were worthless, the gift that was supposed to be her destruction. "Yes," she said, "this is our home." She picked up the first load of belongings and began walking south along the high ground on the east bank of the creek. Behind her, her daughters followed. They had no choice. Neither did she. The first night they slept in the wagon, huddled together under blankets that were not warm enough, listening to the sounds of the swamp. Frogs singing in choruses that rose and fell. Owls calling from the darkness. Something large moving through the water, splashing, hunting. Coraline lay awake with her daughters pressed against her sides and made herself think. She thought about what she had: 17 acres, a wagon, tools, seeds, two daughters who depended on her for everything. She thought about what she needed: shelter, food, water that was safe to drink, safety from the animals and the weather, and the thousand dangers that waited in a place like this. She thought about what everyone believed would happen to her, that she would fail, that she would come crawling back, that she would prove that Harlan Vance had been right about her all along. In the darkness, Coraline made a decision. She would not fail. She would not beg. She would take these 17 acres of water and mud and cypress trees, and she would turn them into something that no one had ever imagined. And someday, she thought, the people who sent me here will understand what they threw away. The morning of her second day, Coraline climbed the highest point of the ridge that ran along the eastern edge of her property. The ridge was not dramatic. It rose perhaps 4 or 5 feet above the waterline, a gentle slope of clay and stone that someone unfamiliar with bottomland might have overlooked entirely. But Coraline had grown up on a small farm, and her father had taught her to read terrain the way other fathers taught their daughters to read scripture. From the top of the ridge, she could see everything. To the west, the swamp spread out in a vast sheet of standing water, cypress trees rising from it at intervals, their trunks swelling at the base into the distinctive shapes that gave them their name: bald cypress. Trees that had been standing in that water for hundreds of years. The water was not stagnant. She could see that now. It moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, flowing from north to south. The creek fed into the swamp at the northern end and drained out at the southern end, creating a current so gentle that it was invisible unless you watched carefully. And the swamp was not empty. Fish jumped in the channels between the cypress stands, silver flashes that caught the light. Birds waded in the shallows, herons and egrets standing motionless, waiting for prey. Turtles basked on fallen logs. A kingfisher dove into the water with precision. And beyond the wildlife, Coraline saw something else. She saw the ridge, 4 acres of dry land running along the eastern edge, high enough to be above the waterline even during floods, solid enough to build on. Oaks and hickories grew here, hardwood trees that preferred dry soil, trees that could be felled and shaped into lumber. And there were tulip poplars, 6 of them, growing along the highest part of the ridge. Massive trees over 100 feet tall, their trunks 3 feet in diameter. Tulip poplar was the most valuable lumber tree in Tennessee. A single tree of this size could be sold for $10 or $12. 6 trees, $60. Standing right there on her property. Coraline looked at what she had been given. Harlan Vance had called it worthless. Permelia Vance had called it fitting. But Coraline saw the ridge and the hardwood trees and the tulip poplars and the water teeming with fish and the birds waiting in the shallows, and she understood something that Harlan Vance had never bothered to discover. The swamp was not worthless. The swamp was a treasure, and Harlan Vance, in his contempt, had handed it to her for free. She found the dog on her third day. She was walking the perimeter of the property when she heard whimpering coming from a thicket of willow scrub. The sound was weak, desperate, the sound of an animal that had been suffering for some time. She pushed through the willows and found a dog lying in a trap. The trap was a crude thing, a steel jaw device meant for catching raccoons. The dog had stepped into it sometime in the past day or two, and the jaws had closed on its front leg, cutting deep into the flesh. The dog was a mongrel, part shepherd and part something else, with fur the color of old gold and ears that did not match, one standing straight up and one flopping over at the tip. It looked up at Coraline with brown eyes that were frightened and surprisingly intelligent, and it did not growl or snap when she knelt beside it. "Easy now," Coraline said. "Easy." She worked the trap carefully, pressing the springs that released the jaws. Blood flowed from the wound, and the dog whimpered but did not try to bite her. She tore a strip from her petticoat and wrapped the leg. Then she gathered the dog in her arms and carried it back to the wagon. Winifred was waiting, her eyes wide. "Mama, what is that?" "A dog," Coraline said. "He was hurt. We are going to help him get better." She tended the wound with hot water and clean cloth. The dog lay still throughout, watching her, and when she was finished, it licked her hand once and closed its eyes. Hattie crawled forward and touched the dog's ear with one small finger. "Dog," Hattie said. It was one of the few words she knew. "His name is Scout," Coraline said, "because he found us, or because we found him." Scout stayed. Within a week, he was walking again, favoring the leg but moving. Within 2 weeks, he was following Coraline everywhere, limping along beside her as she worked. He slept at the foot of the wagon at night, one ear raised, listening for danger. He watched the girls while Coraline worked, keeping them from wandering too close to the water. And at night, when the sounds of the swamp rose up around them, Scout would press his warm body against Coraline's side, and she would feel, for the first time since leaving the Vance farm, that she was not entirely alone. The old man appeared on her 5th day. Coraline was dragging a fallen oak branch toward the ridge when she heard movement in the brush behind her. She spun around, her hand going to the hatchet at her belt, and found herself facing a figure that seemed to have materialized from the swamp itself. He was old, perhaps 70 or more, with a beard that had once been red and was now the color of iron rust streaked with white. His clothes were patched, his boots held together with rawhide, and he carried a rifle that looked older than he was. But his eyes were sharp, clear blue and piercing. "You are the one they sent here," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. "The one with the daughters." Coraline kept her hand on the hatchet. "I am." The old man nodded slowly. "I am Ezekiel Barnwell," he said. "People call me Zeke. I have lived on the edge of this swamp for 40 years. Coraline waited. "I saw you arrive," Zeke continued. "Watched you from the trees. Wanted to see what kind of woman they had sent this time." "This time?" Zeke spat into the brush. "There have been others. Men mostly. Come to claim the land, drain the swamp, make something of it. They lasted a season, maybe 2. Then they left or they died." Coraline said nothing. "But you," Zeke said, "you are different. I can see it." "How can you see it?" "Because you have been here 5 days and you have not tried to fight the swamp. You have been watching it, learning it. That is what the smart ones do." He reached into his coat and pulled out something that he tossed to Coraline. She caught it reflexively. It was a fish, freshly caught, cleaned and ready for cooking. "The swamp is not your enemy," Zeke said. "The swamp is a vault that fools do not know how to open. But I think you might figure out the combination." He turned to go, then paused. "If you need help, my cabin is a mile north along the creek. The dog knows the way. He used to be mine, before he wandered off and got himself caught in that trap." Coraline looked down at Scout, who was watching Zeke with an expression that might have been recognition. "Why would you help me?" Zeke was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Because I have watched a lot of people come to this swamp thinking they knew better than it, and I have watched all of them lose. But you look like someone who knows how to listen, and listeners are rare." He walked away into the trees, and within seconds he had vanished. Coraline stood holding the fish, watching the space where he had been. Then she looked at Scout. "Well," she said, "I suppose we have a neighbor. If this story has touched your heart, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. The Warm Floor brings you stories of strength, survival, and the quiet power of those who refuse to give up. Now let us continue with what Coraline built from nothing. The cabin took 7 weeks to build. Coraline worked from dawn to dusk every day, with breaks only to feed her daughters and tend to their needs. She felled oaks on the ridge using an axe with a cracked handle that she had wrapped with rawhide to make it hold. She notched each log by hand, rolling them into position using a leverage system of poles and rope that her father had taught her when she was 12 years old. Zeke came to help with the heavy work. He did not ask permission, and Coraline did not offer thanks. He simply appeared when the work was difficult and disappeared when it was done. And between them, in the span of those 7 weeks, they raised a structure that would last for generations. The cabin was 14 feet wide and 18 feet deep, with a single room and a loft for sleeping. The logs were oak, solid and heavy, fitted together so tightly that a knife blade could not pass between them. The chinks were filled with clay mixed with Spanish moss. The hearth was river rock gathered from the creek. The floor was packed earth, hardened with a wash of clay that dried to a smooth dark surface. The roof was cypress bark, layered so thickly that not a drop of rain would penetrate, and the cabin faced west. Coraline chose the orientation deliberately. The front door and the single window looked out over the swamp. Every evening, when the sun went down, the light poured through that window and filled the cabin with gold. Winifred asked her why. Because Coraline said, "I want you to see the sunset every night. I want you to see something beautiful every single day." The night they moved in, all three of them lay together on the packed earth floor with blankets beneath them and Scout curled at their feet. "Mama," Winifred whispered, "this house is smaller than grandmother's house. But nobody yells here." "No," Coraline said, "nobody yells here." That was the moment Winifred began to understand what home really meant. The raised beds were an experiment born of desperation and memory. Coraline had found the book in the library of the Vance farmhouse during her second year of marriage, a thin volume about agricultural techniques from around the world. She had read it in stolen moments, hiding it beneath her apron when Permelia walked past. The book had described a method of farming used in flooded river valleys. Instead of draining the water, farmers built raised platforms of soil above the waterline, creating islands of dry earth surrounded by shallow water. The plants grew on the platforms, the water provided constant moisture from below, and the standing water around the beds prevented insects from reaching the crops. Coraline had remembered the technique. Now she would find out if it worked. She built the first beds in May, frames of split oak logs filled with a mixture of swamp muck and ridge clay. Each bed was 3 feet wide and 12 feet long, rising 18 inches above the waterline. She planted tomatoes in the first bed, squash in the second, peppers and beans in the third, and then she waited. The results came faster than she had dared to hope. By late June, the tomato plants were 3 feet tall and heavy with fruit. The tomatoes themselves were the size of her fist, dark red, their skin tight and their flesh dense with a sweetness that Coraline had never tasted before. She brought one to Zeke. The old man bit into it, juice running down his beard, and his eyebrows rose. "That," he said, "is the best tomato I have eaten in 40 years. "It is the soil," Coraline said. 1,000 years of leaves falling into the water and rotting, all that richness just waiting for someone to use it. Zeke looked at her with those sharp blue eyes. "You figured out the combination. I am beginning to." By the end of the summer, she had 20 raised beds producing more vegetables than she could possibly eat. The standing water around the beds kept the soil moist without drowning the roots. It kept the beetles and cutworms away without poison or effort. And the fish. The fish were everywhere. Coraline built weirs in the channels, V-shaped fences of woven cane that funneled fish into narrow enclosures. Each trap produced 3 to 5 pounds of fish per day. She taught herself to smoke the fish over hickory wood, preserving them for months, and the crawfish. The crawfish burrowed in the mud throughout the swamp, thousands of them, a food source so abundant that Coraline could not understand why the bottomland was considered worthless. Then she realized, the local farmers did not eat crawfish. Crawfish were poor food, swamp food, the food of people who had nothing better. Coraline did not share this prejudice. She ate the crawfish. She ate the fish. She ate the vegetables from her raised beds. She ate better than she had eaten in 5 years at the Vance farm, and she began to sell. The first time Coraline brought her produce to the market in Millbrook, people stared. She arrived in the wagon with Scout walking beside her, Winifred sitting on the seat with Hattie in her lap. The wagon was loaded with baskets of tomatoes and squash, buckets of live crawfish, and bundles of smoked fish. People stared because they knew who she was. The woman thrown out by the Vance family, the woman given 17 acres of swamp, the woman everyone expected to fail. Gideon Blackwell was the first to speak. Blackwell was the richest man in the county, owner of 200 acres of prime farmland. He walked over to Coraline's wagon and looked at her tomatoes with disbelief. "Where did you get these?" "I grew them," Coraline replied. "Where?" "On my property. The swamp on Willow Creek." Blackwell laughed. Swamps do not produce tomatoes. Swamps produce mosquitoes and fever and failure. Coraline held up one of the tomatoes, dark red and perfect. Then what is this? Blackwell did not have an answer. He walked away, and Coraline heard him say to someone, "She must have stolen them. That land cannot grow anything." Dr. Ambrose Whitfield came next. He was the town doctor, a man with a degree from Nashville, a man who believed that science had the answer to everything. "The pH of swamp soil is far too acidic for vegetable cultivation," he announced. "These plants cannot possibly be healthy. By winter, everything you have grown will be worthless." Coraline pointed to the tomatoes on her wagon. "Does that look worthless to you?" Whitfield sniffed. "I do not trust appearances. I trust data." He left, convinced of his own rightness. Reverend Josiah Tatum came to offer spiritual counsel. "My child," he said, "God gave mankind the high ground for a reason. The swamps are the territories of darkness. By choosing to live there, you are placing yourself outside of God's design." Coraline looked at him. "Do you see the herons standing in the water?" "I see them. Did God make them? Of course. Then perhaps God's design is larger than you imagine." Tatum left, muttering about theological pride in women. Opal Kincaid came to the market the following week, not to buy but to observe. She was the wife of the general store owner, a woman whose tongue was sharper than any blade in her husband's inventory. She walked past Coraline's wagon slowly, looking at the tomatoes, looking at the smoked fish, looking at the woman who had been cast out. "Poor thing," Opal said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Living in that swamp with two small children. I give her until Christmas before she comes crawling back to civilization." She did not buy anything. She simply walked away, leaving her words behind like seeds planted in fertile soil. The gossip spread. Within a week, everyone in Millbrook knew that Opal Kincaid had predicted Coraline's failure. Luther Doss was the first to put money on it. He was 22 years old, the son of the town blacksmith, a young man with more confidence than sense. He stood in front of the general store and announced that he was betting $5 that Coraline Vance would sell her land before autumn. $5, he said. Easy money. No woman survives alone in a swamp. He would remember those words for the rest of his life. But not everyone was hostile. A woman approached the wagon, a woman with dark skin and careful eyes. Her name was Nella Ashby. She was a widow who sold herbs and medicines at the market, and she was treated by most of the townspeople with the same dismissive contempt they showed to Coraline. "These tomatoes," Nella said, "where did you really grow them?" "The swamp on Willow Creek. Raised beds built above the waterline?" Nella's eyes widened. "I have heard of such methods." "The swamp soil is rich," Coraline said. "The water keeps the pests away." Nella bought 3 tomatoes. She came back the next week and bought more. And she brought something else, knowledge. Nella knew herbs. She knew which plants healed and which ones harmed. And she was willing to share that knowledge with a woman who, like herself, had been cast out. A friendship formed between them. They were both women who had been told they had no value. They were both proving the world wrong. The worst visitor came in September. Virgil Pruitt. Pruitt was 35 years old, the son of a landowner whose property bordered the Vance holdings. He understood the value of land better than most, and he had discovered something that the Vances had never bothered to learn. The tulip poplars on Coraline's Ridge were worth money. Real money. He arrived in a clean shirt and pressed trousers, his manner polite, his smile friendly. He complimented Coraline on what she had accomplished. He expressed concern for her welfare, and then he made his offer. $15 for the entire property, land and timber and everything on it. Coraline looked at him. "The timber alone is worth more than that." Pruitt's smile did not waver, but something cold entered his eyes. "You are a woman alone," he said. "This land is dangerous. Accidents happen. It would be a shame if something were to happen to you or your daughters." Scout stood up. His hackles rose. A low growl rumbled in his throat. "My dog does not like you," Coraline said. "I trust my dog." Pruitt looked at Scout. His smile faded. "You will regret this." He turned and walked away. 2 weeks later, 3 of Coraline's raised beds were destroyed in the night. The frames had been kicked apart, the plants trampled. Coraline rebuilt them. A week after that, her fish traps were cut. She rebuilt those too. She bought a shotgun from Zeke and learned to shoot it, and she made sure that Pruitt knew she had it. The sabotage stopped. If you are enjoying this story, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like these deserve to be remembered. Now let us see what happened when nature itself tested Coraline. The storm came in November. It began with a darkening of the sky in the southwest and a stillness in the air that made the birds stop singing and the fish stop jumping. Coraline saw the signs. Zeke had taught her to read them, the greenish tint to the clouds, the way the leaves turned their undersides to the sky. She gathered the girls and Scout into the cabin. She closed the shutters. She filled every container with fresh water, and then she waited. The first night was loud. Wind that screamed through the cypress trees, tearing branches loose. Rain that fell in sheets. The second night was worse. The wind strengthened. A corner of the roof lifted, and water poured in, soaking the bedding, soaking the girls. Coraline worked through the night with rags and buckets, trying to contain the flood. Winifred helped as much as a 4-year-old could. Hattie cried. By dawn of the third day, Hattie had stopped crying. She had stopped doing anything. Her small body was burning with fever. Her eyes were glazed. When Coraline lifted her, the child was limp. Coraline felt her heart stop. Not this, she thought. Not my daughter. Not here. There was no doctor. The nearest one was 6 miles away through flooded roads. But Nella was only 2 miles away. Coraline bundled Hattie in blankets and gave Winifred strict instructions to stay inside with Scout. Then she stepped out into the storm. The world had become water. The path to Nella's cabin was submerged to knee depth, and the current was strong. She pushed forward, holding Hattie against her chest, protecting the child's face from the rain. 1 mile, then 2. Nella was waiting. She had seen Coraline coming and had opened her door, and when Coraline stumbled inside with Hattie in her arms, Nella did not ask questions. She simply took the child and laid her by the fire and began to work. Elderberry syrup, willow bark tea, a poultice of herbs applied to Hattie's chest. They worked through the night, through the 4th day, through the 5th. On the morning of the 6th day, Hattie opened her eyes. "Mama," she said. Her voice was weak but clear. "Scout licked my face." Scout was not there. Scout was still at the cabin with Winifred, but Coraline did not correct her. She simply gathered her daughter in her arms and wept. The storm passed. Coraline returned to find Zeke already repairing the roof. He had walked through the flood when the storm ended, found Winifred alone with Scout, and understood what had happened. He did not speak. He simply continued working. By nightfall, the roof was repaired. By the following week, the damaged beds had been rebuilt. Life continued, but something had changed in Coraline. The storm had tested her. It had nearly taken her daughter. It had shown her how fragile everything was, and it had shown her something else. She was not alone. Nella had come when needed. Zeke had come when needed. People who owed her nothing had chosen to help anyway. This was different from the Vance family. This was real. The second year was better. Coraline expanded to 35 raised beds. She built a proper smokehouse. She acquired ducks, 18 Muscovy ducks that lived on the swamp, and produced eggs and meat without requiring a single grain of feed. The ducks had names. Hattie named them all. Duchess, Lady, Countess, Baroness. Winifred learned to help with the fish traps. At 5 years old, she could paddle the flat-bottom boat and count the catch. Scout grew older and calmer. He slept on the porch during the day and at the foot of the girl's bed at night. And Coraline sold. Every week, the produce and smoked fish sold faster than she could supply them. People who had laughed at her the first year now waited for her to arrive. The third year was better still. She built an addition to the cabin. She built a root cellar dug into the ridge, where vegetables and fish could be stored for months. She sold 2 tulip poplars for $16 and kept the other 4. A standing tree was a savings account. A cut tree was cash that spent in a day. Emmett Yancey appeared in the third year. He was 17 years old, the son of a hired man who worked for the Vance family. He came to the swamp in secret because he had heard about what Coraline had built, and he wanted to learn. "Mrs. Vance," he said, standing at the edge of the ridge, I want to know how you made those raised beds work. Why? Because what you are doing matters. And what they are doing at the Vance farm does not. Coraline looked at this young man who had walked 6 miles to ask questions no one else had thought to ask. Come back tomorrow, she said. I will show you. Emmett returned before dawn. He found Coraline already at the raised beds, her hands moving with the efficiency of long practice. Show me, he said. Show me everything. So she did. She taught him how to read the water level, how to know when the beds needed more muck, how to identify the channels where fish congregated. She taught him the difference between cypress and tupelo, between crawfish burrows and muskrat dens. Emmett learned quickly. He had the hunger of someone who had been starving for knowledge without knowing it. Why are you teaching me? He asked one afternoon. I am nobody. Coraline looked at him. Because I was nobody too, and someone taught me. She thought of Zeke. Knowledge that is hoarded dies, she said. Knowledge that is shared lives forever. Emmett nodded. He understood. Years later, when he had his own farm and his own students, he would say the same thing to them. By the spring of 1888, Coraline stood on the ridge and looked at what she had built. A cabin, a smokehouse, a root cellar, 35 raised beds, fish traps and crawfish cages, a flock of ducks. She had taken 17 acres of swamp that everyone said was worthless and turned it into the most productive small farm in the county. And she was not finished. The drought began in April of 1888. At first, it seemed like nothing unusual. A dry spell, a late start to the spring rains. But the week passed, then 2 weeks, then a month. The rains did not come. By June, the wells across Perry County were dropping. By July, they were running dry. The crops died. Tobacco withered in the fields. Corn yellowed and collapsed. Gardens produced nothing. Livestock suffered. Cattle with no water. Horses too weak to work. The county had not seen a drought this severe in 35 years. But the swamp did not dry. The water level dropped 12 inches. But it held. Fed by Willow Creek, fed by the groundwater that seeped into the bottomland, the swamp refused to die. The raised beds stayed moist. The plants kept growing, the fish traps kept filling, and Coraline kept selling. She was the only farmer at the market with fresh vegetables. People who had laughed at her were now coming to buy from her. People who had called her land worthless were now asking how she did it. In August, they started coming to the swamp itself. Farmers with empty wagons and dry wells, asking if they could fill their barrels from Willow Creek. She gave them water. She gave them vegetables. She gave them fish. She did not ask for anything in return, because the swamp had taught her that abundance is not diminished by sharing. The Vance farm was dying. Coraline heard about it from the people who came to fill their water barrels. The well had run dry in July. The tobacco crop had failed completely. Harlan Vance had sold 20 head of cattle at prices that barely covered the cost of transporting them. Permelia was sick, and Josiah. Josiah came to the swamp in August. He came alone, walking the 6 miles, arriving at the edge of Coraline's property just as the sun was setting. He stood at the bottom of the ridge, looking up at the cabin and the smokehouse and the dock. He did not call out. Coraline saw him from the porch. She recognized him immediately. 3 years had changed him. He was thinner. His face was lined. She walked down the ridge to where he stood. Neither spoke for a long moment. You have done something remarkable here, Josiah said. Coraline said nothing. I did not come to ask for anything. I came to warn you. Father is planning to challenge the deed. He says it was signed under duress. The deed is valid. He signed it himself. I know, I told him that. But he does not listen to me. He looked past her, at the cabin on the ridge. The girls, how are they? They are well. Do they remember me? Coraline hesitated. He understood. Of course they did not remember him. He had stood at that window and watched his family be cast out. He had not visited in 3 years. I deserve that, he said quietly. Yes, you do. He nodded. Then he turned to go. Josiah, he stopped. Tell your father, if he brings lawyers, I will bring lawyers of my own. The deed is solid. He will not win. Josiah looked at her for a long moment. Then something like a smile crossed his face. You have changed. No, Coraline replied. I have become who I always was. I simply did not have the space to show it before. He walked away into the gathering darkness. Coraline watched him go. She felt something she had not expected. Not anger, not bitterness. Something like sadness. For the man he could have been. For the years wasted because he did not have courage. She turned and walked back to her cabin, to her daughters, to the life she had built without him. We are coming to the heart of the story now. If you have been following along, take a moment to share this video with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe to The Warm Floor for more stories of resilience and hope. September brought the lawsuit. Harlan Vance arrived at the swamp with Virgil Pruitt and a lawyer from Nashville. They came in a wagon, stopping at the edge of Coraline's property. Coraline was waiting. She had known they were coming. Word travels fast in a small county. She stood on the ridge with Scout at her side and the deed in her hand, and a young lawyer named Harrison Ford standing beside her. Harlan climbed down from the wagon. He was 62 years old now, and the drought had aged him. His face was gaunt, his clothes hung loose, but his voice was still strong. That land belongs to the Vance family. The deed was signed under duress. Coraline held up the deed. This document bears your signature. It bears the signatures of 2 witnesses. It was registered with the county clerk. You were forced to take it. I was given a choice between taking this land and leaving with nothing. I chose to take the land. That is not duress. The lawyers argued. They produced documents. They cited precedents. But Coraline was watching Harlan. She saw the desperation in his eyes. She understood what this lawsuit was really about. It was not about the land. It was about pride. Harlan Vance had given away 17 acres of swamp to humiliate a woman. He had expected her to fail. Instead, she had succeeded while his own farm crumbled, and he could not stand it. Coraline stepped forward. Mr. Vance, she said quietly, you gave me this land because you thought it was worthless. You wanted me to fail. I gave you a generous gift. You gave me a curse, but I turned it into a blessing, and now you cannot forgive me for proving you wrong. She held up the deed. This land is mine, legally, morally, and in every way that matters. You signed it over. You cannot take it back. Harlan stared at her. Then, without a word, he turned and climbed back into the wagon. Virgil Pruitt lingered for a moment. This is not over. Yes, it is, Coraline said. They drove away. October brought death. Not to the Vance farm, not to the swamp. Death came to Ezekiel Barnwell. Coraline found him on a Tuesday morning. She had gone to his cabin to bring him food, as she did every week, and found the door standing open and Scout whining on the threshold. Zeke was lying in his bed, his hands folded on his chest, his face peaceful. He had died in his sleep. He was 73 years old. He had lived alone in the swamp for 41 years. Coraline sat beside his body for a long time, not crying, just sitting. She thought about the fish he had brought her on her 5th day, the knowledge he had shared, the help he had given. She buried him on the high ground of the ridge, beside the tulip poplars. Winifred, now 7 years old, placed wildflowers on the grave. Mr. Beard, she said solemnly, we will not forget you. Hattie, now 5, stood silently beside her sister. Scout sat at the edge of the grave, his head low. Coraline spoke the words that needed to be spoken. You taught me that this land was not my enemy. You taught me that knowledge passed down through generations has value no school can give. Rest now. I will take care of what you taught me. In Zeke's cabin, she found his journals. 40 years of observations about the swamp. She brought them back to her cabin and began to read. November. The drought had broken in late October, but the damage was done. The crops had failed. The livestock had died or been sold. The debts had come due. The Vance farm was in ruins. Harlan had borrowed against everything he owned. Permelia was bedridden. Josiah was trying to hold things together, but he had never learned how. On the last day of November, Harlan Vance came to the swamp. He came alone. No lawyers, no Virgil Pruitt. Just an old man in a wagon, driving slowly down the track, stopping at the same place where he had stopped with his lawsuit 2 months before. But this was a different man. The arrogance was gone. The pride was gone. Something essential had broken inside him. He climbed down slowly. He walked to the base of the ridge and stopped. He did not climb up. He did not demand. He simply stood there, looking up at the cabin where his granddaughters lived, at the woman he had cast out, at the land he had called worthless. And he said 6 words: "We need to be helped." Not "we need help." We need to be helped. A confession, an admission, a breaking. Coraline looked at the man who had given her 17 acres of swamp and told her to leave. The man who had called her children disappointments. The man who had tried to take back the land when she succeeded. She could turn him away. She had every right. But then Winifred appeared at her side. "Mama," the 7-year-old said, "that man looks sad." Coraline looked at her daughter. She thought about the lessons she wanted Winifred to learn, about strength and independence, but also about mercy. She thought about Zeke, who had helped her for no reason except that helping was what good people did. She thought about Nella, who had walked through a storm to save Hattie's life. She looked at Harlan Vance, and she walked down the ridge to where he stood. "What do you need?" Harlan could barely meet her eyes. "Permelia is very sick. We have no food, no money, nothing left." He paused. "I am not asking for myself. I am asking for her. She does not deserve to die because of my mistakes." Coraline was silent for a long moment. "I will give you food. Fish, vegetables, eggs. Enough to get through the winter." Harlan's eyes widened. "You would do that? After everything?" "I am not doing it for you. I am doing it because my daughters are watching, and I want them to learn that strength is not the same as cruelty." She turned and walked back up the ridge. Behind her, she heard Harlan say a single word: "Thank you." 1 week later, they came again. All of them. Harlan in the wagon. Permelia lying in the back, wrapped in blankets, too weak to sit up. Josiah driving. They stopped at the base of the ridge. Josiah climbed down. He looked at Coraline, at the cabin, at the swamp that had sustained what his family's farm could not. "Could we stay here? Just for the winter, until the spring crop comes in?" The words hung in the air. Coraline looked at Josiah. She looked at the wagon, at Permelia's frail form, at Harlan's bowed head. But then Hattie ran past her. The 5-year-old scrambled down the ridge and stopped at the wagon. She looked up at Harlan, at the man who had called her a disappointment on the day she was born, and she held out an egg. "Here," Hattie said. "Lady laid this one this morning. It is a good one." Harlan looked at the egg in his granddaughter's hand. He looked at the child's face, open and innocent, his eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," he whispered. Coraline watched this. She felt something shift inside her, some final wall falling away. She walked down the ridge. "You can stay," she said. Josiah's face crumpled with relief. "But there are conditions. On this land, there is no master and no servant. There is no man above woman. If you stay here, you work. All of you, as equals." Harlan nodded slowly, and Permelia from the wagon, her voice weak but clear, said, "I understand." Coraline looked at the woman who had made her eat in the kitchen, the woman who had called her children failures. Something in Permelia's expression had changed, something that looked like regret. Coraline held her gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Come. The cabin has room." The winter of 1888 to 1889 was the hardest any of them had ever known, and the most meaningful. The first week was the most difficult. Harlan had never taken orders from anyone, let alone a woman. His hands fumbled with tasks that Coraline performed without thinking. He could not bait a crawfish trap. He could not check a fish weir without falling into the water. Coraline watched him struggle. She could have mocked him. She could have reminded him of every cruel word he had ever spoken. Instead, she taught him. "Like this," she said, showing him how to set the trap. "The bait goes in the back. The door faces downstream." Harlan watched her hands. He copied her movements. He failed. He tried again. By the end of the first week, he could set a trap without help. By the end of the first month, he could check the raised beds and report which plants needed attention. By the end of the winter, he understood something that had never occurred to him in 60 years. The swamp was not chaos. The swamp was a system. And once you understood the system, it gave you everything you needed. One evening, sitting by the fire, Harlan said, "I spent my whole life fighting the land, trying to make it do what I wanted. You work with it. You listened to it. Coraline nodded. The land was here before us. It will be here after us. The only question is whether we learn from it or struggle against it. Harlan was quiet for a long moment. I wish I had known that 60 years ago. So do I, Coraline said. So do I. Parmelia recovered slowly. Rest, food, and Nella's herbal remedies brought her back from the edge. But she had changed. The cold, imperious woman who had made Coraline eat in the kitchen was gone. In her place was someone quieter, more thoughtful. One evening, Parmelia asked if she could tell the girls a story. Coraline hesitated. Then she nodded. Parmelia sat by the fire with Winifred and Hattie at her feet, and she told them about her own childhood, about the farm where she had grown up, about her mother who had died young, about the fear and hardness that had grown in her. She did not apologize directly, but the story itself was an apology. When she finished, Winifred said, "That sounds lonely, grandmother." Parmelia's eyes filled with tears. It was. It was very lonely. And then Hattie climbed into her grandmother's lap. "You are not lonely now," Hattie said. Coraline watched this. She felt the last hard knot of anger inside her dissolve. Not forgiveness, exactly. The wounds were too deep, but acceptance, release. She had won. Not because they were here. She had won because she had built a life better than the one they had offered her. That was enough. If this story has moved you, take a moment to share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stories of forgiveness and strength deserve to be told. Subscribe to The Warm Floor for more tales from the frontier. Spring came early, and with it, something unexpected. Harlan Vance asked to speak with Coraline alone. They walked to the dock that overlooked the swamp. The water was high with spring rains. The raised beds were ready for planting. Life was beginning again. Harlan stood for a long moment, looking at the wet land that had become her kingdom. Then he spoke. "I was wrong. Not about one thing. About everything." He turned to face Coraline. "I told myself that I was protecting the family legacy, that sons were necessary, that daughters were disappointments, that you had failed us." His voice broke. "But I was the failure. I could not see what was in front of me. I could not see that my granddaughters are extraordinary. I could not see that you were building something more valuable than anything I ever built." Coraline said nothing. She let him speak. "I gave you this land to destroy you. I wanted you to fail." He looked at the swamp, at the world she had created from nothing. "You were not the one who failed to produce an heir. I was the one who failed to recognize what an heir truly is." Coraline felt tears in her eyes, not sadness or anger. Release. "You do not need to apologize to me," she said. "You need to apologize to Winifred and Hattie." "I will. I will spend whatever time I have left trying to be the grandfather they deserve. And Josiah. He needs to hear this too." Harlan closed his eyes. "I told him last night. I told him I was wrong to control him. I told him that if he wanted to be a better man than I was, he would need to find his own way." What did he say? He did not say anything, but he wept. And I think perhaps that was the first honest conversation we have ever had. They stood in silence. Then Harlan said, "I do not expect forgiveness. I do not deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I see now. Forgiveness is not something I can give all at once," Coraline said. "But I can give you a chance. The same chance this swamp gave me." She gestured at the water. "This place taught me that even the things people throw away can become valuable. Maybe people are the same." Harlan nodded. "Maybe they are." The weeks passed. Harlan kept his word. He apologized to Winifred and Hattie, not once, but repeatedly. He taught them what he knew about farming. He became, slowly, the grandfather he should have been. Josiah tried to rebuild his relationship with his daughters. It was harder. The girls had no memory of him as a father. But he tried. He showed up day after day. Parmelia grew stronger. By May, she was working in the raised beds. And one day she said to Coraline, "I was cruel to you. For 5 years. I do not have an excuse. I only have regret." Coraline looked at her. "You can be different. That is what the swamp taught me. Nothing is fixed. Everything can change." Parmelia nodded. Tears ran down her cheeks. "Thank you for letting us stay, for being better than we were." The skeptics changed their tune. Gideon Blackwell stopped laughing at swamp farming. His silence was its own admission. Dr. Ambrose Whitfield wrote a small article about alternative agricultural methods. He did not mention Coraline by name, but everyone knew. Reverend Tatum added a new line to his sermons. God's designs are often larger than we understand. Opal Kincaid became one of Coraline's most loyal customers. She never apologized, but she stopped gossiping. Luther Doss paid his $5 bet. Then he asked Coraline to teach him to build raised beds. She taught him. She taught anyone who asked. Because knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied. Scout died in the winter of 1893. He was 11 years old. His muzzle had gone white. His steps had slowed. On the morning he died, he did not get up. Coraline knew before she touched him. There was a stillness that spoke of finality. She sat beside him anyway, stroking his fur, remembering. The trap in the willows, the brown eyes watching her as she freed him. The nights he had pressed against her side. He had been with her through everything. She buried him on the ridge beside Zeke. Winifred, now 12, placed a stone on the grave. She had carved words into it. Scout, loyal friend, 1885 to 1893. Hattie, now 10, said, "He found us, or we found him. I am glad either way." Permelia died in the spring of 1894. She had lived 5 more years than anyone expected. 5 years to become a different person. 5 years to know her granddaughters. Her last words were to Coraline. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything. But I am grateful." They buried her on the ridge. Harlan lived until 1901. He spent his last years on the swamp, working in the raised beds, tending the fish traps. He became, in his own way, a student of the land. On his last day, he sat on the dock and watched the sunset over the swamp that had given her everything. "This," he said to Coraline, "is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." "I know." He closed his eyes. "I wasted so many years, looking at the wrong things. And all this time, the real treasure was right here." He gestured weakly. "Not the land. You. The girls. The family I almost lost." Coraline took his hand. "You did not lose us. You are here." He smiled. "Thanks to you." He died that night. They buried him on the ridge with the others. By 1895, 10 years after she had arrived with nothing, Coraline's techniques had spread throughout the bottomlands of Perry County. 7 families were farming the wetlands using raised beds. 12 families were smoking fish for market. Emmett Yancey had built his own swamp farm and was teaching others. The swamp was no longer a curse, it was a blessing, and everyone knew who had shown them the way. Coraline Vance died in the winter of 1920, at the age of 60. She had lived 35 years in the swamp. She had raised her daughters there, watched them grow into women, watched them marry and have children of their own. She had seen the raised bed technique spread throughout the Tennessee bottomlands. She had lived long enough to see scholars from the University of Tennessee come to study her methods. They measured the soil, they analyzed the water, they documented the yields, and they concluded what Coraline had known for decades, that swamp agriculture, properly managed, was among the most productive farming systems in North America. She died in her cabin, the same cabin she had built in 1885. The windows still faced west. The sunset still poured through in gold. Winifred was with her at the end, and Hattie, and grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who had been told stories about the woman who built a paradise from a swamp. "I am not sad," Coraline said. "I have lived a good life. I have loved and been loved. I have built something that will last." She looked at her daughters. "Remember, the things people call worthless may be the most valuable things of all. The places they reject may be the places where life grows best. And the people they throw away may be the people who change everything." She smiled. "I was thrown away. And look what I became." She died that night, peacefully. They buried her on the ridge beside Zeke and Scout and Permelia and Harlan. Epilogue: the swamp is still there. The ridge still rises along the eastern edge. The tulip poplars that Coraline refused to sell have grown massive. The cabin has been restored and preserved. The Perry County Historical Society maintains it as a museum. Visitors come from around the country. They walk the dock that Coraline built. They read the historical markers. And they stand at the graves on the ridge. 5 graves. Zeke and Scout and Permelia, and Harlan and Coraline. A family that began in cruelty and ended in redemption. In 1978, researchers from the University of Tennessee published a study on wetland agriculture. They cited Coraline's methods extensively. The principles she discovered, they wrote, remain relevant today. The integration of aquaculture and agriculture, the use of natural pest control, the recognition of wetland soil fertility. These insights were ahead of their time. Coraline would have smiled at that. She never thought of herself as ahead of her time. She was simply a woman who had been thrown away by people who did not understand her value. A woman who had been given a curse and turned it into a blessing. Swamp is not a word that people use when they give you something valuable. But sometimes the things people call worthless are the most valuable things of all. Sometimes the places people reject are the places where life grows best. And sometimes the people who are thrown away are the people who change everything. Coraline Vance was thrown away, and look what she became. Settle back, listen carefully, and journey with us through the legends, hard truths, and enduring wisdom of the American frontier. Subscribe to The Warm Floor. The fire is warm. The end.